that you're either here because you really need to learn how to have balance in your life, or you are doing okay, but you want to make sure you don't fall into that trap, or you just wanted to listen to an English accent for the next half an hour or so. I don't know which camp you fall in, but unhealthy patterns might be you're either someone who doesn't do enough with the time that you've got. So you're apathetic, or you're unmotivated, or you're fearful, or you're just lazy. And so you are not using your time well, or more likely you feel maxed out. You're not so good at saying no, or you perhaps feel quite exhausted and overwhelmed at times. You're unaware of your limits. And if you are in that camp, then you have good company. 20% of British workers take time off from work due to stress each year. So 1 in 5, and over 5 million Brits admit that they spend most of their lives very or extremely stressed. So just a little bit of honesty here. I know I can't see all of you, but how many of you would say you are a little bit stressed, or you feel like life is quite full on at the moment? Can you just raise your hand? Yeah, great. So that is actually most of you. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you for your honesty. So I think this is a really difficult area of our lives to manage, because everyone has different amounts of energy due to their season of life, or their capacity, or their motivation. And because everyone is different, you can't just look at your friends and copy their example. So my friend Faye has a very high capacity for work. So she's got 2 jobs. She oversees 4 small groups in church, and she preaches regularly, and she's doing fine. Whereas my friend Paula is very godly, very capable, but she would feel overwhelmed if she was just doing 1 or 2 of those things. And 1 or 2 of those things would leave her feeling stressed. So everyone has to learn to manage their capacity and their season of life carefully, and also in quite a personal level. You can't just look at someone else. And I think a huge part of the busyness that we have in our lives is due to the world that we live in constantly pushes us to max out our lives, and we don't know where to find true rest for our soul and our mind and body. So for many of us, the way we relax is actually not doing us much good. And the environment that we live in is constantly selling us a lifestyle that might look effortless, but actually requires us buying certain products or certain lifestyles to really sort of engage in the way the world wants us to. And so I'm so glad you're here. I'm really glad you're being honest with yourselves, and I really hope the time I've got will do you good. So this is what I'm going to try and do today. I'm going to try and give you some biblical and practical advice as to how to find true rest. And the Bible calls that Sabbath, and how to work from that place. So so in the time that I've got, the best way I can help you guys that are feeling maxed out is by saying you need to find true rest on your Sabbath, and you need to work from that place. So that's my aim, okay, in the time we've got. Why don't you just turn to the person next to you and tell them what I'm going to do with this seminar. I'm just testing that you're listening. What am I going to ask? What am I going to do with you today? Great. So I'm going to teach you what true rest is, and the Bible calls that a Sabbath. I'm going to help you work from that place. So I think most of us imagine rest as the absence of responsibility, or a day where we can do nothing. If you were just to imagine in your minds a restful Saturday or day off, I wonder what that day would look like for you. So for many people, it's a day where you don't have to do anything, where you can put your feet up, you can enjoy a tub of ice cream, endless Netflix. And for some of you, that sounds like heaven. But also there's a flip side. For some of you, that sort of restful day sounds bad. It sounds unproductive or lazy or unfulfilling and wasteful. And it's no surprise that the Bible understands true rest, not as loafing. I don't know if you have that word in the States, as totally vegging out. It doesn't see it as that, but rather true rest is the active pursuit of spiritual, emotional, and physical replenishment. So that's worth writing down if you're taking notes. True rest, biblical rest, is the active pursuit of spiritual, emotional, and physical replenishment. So Sabbath is not meant to be about sloth. True rest isn't lazy. Yet rest is one of the great promises of the gospel. And so that's why it's something we need to understand properly. So I've got a video to show you now that I think does a brilliant job of helping you understand the biblical background to the idea of Sabbath, of true rest. So let me play that to you now.
Did that go away?
I think he's sharing the screen. Oh.
The number 7 is a big deal in the Bible.
Yeah, in biblical Hebrew, the word 7 is connected to the idea of fullness or completeness.
And that's something we all long for, but don't often experience. Instead, we find ourselves working endlessly, fighting back chaos with no real rest.
Yes. Now keep all that in mind as we turn to Genesis 1 in the Bible. It begins with darkness and disorder, but then God speaks to bring about light and order so that life can flourish.
And this happens over the course of 6 days.
Each day is marked with the phrase, there was evening and there was morning. But on the 7th day, something special happens.
God stops and rests.
Right. Creation is brought to its completion on the 7th day. And that phrase, there was evening and there was morning, it doesn't appear on day 7.
It's like a day with no end.
On the 7th day, God's presence fills his creation. The land provides for all of God's creatures, including humans, who are appointed to rule the world with God forever.
Kings and queens of the 7th day rest. I can get into that.
But the humans are deceived by a dark power, and they forfeit that rest. They're exiled into the wilderness, where they have to work as slaves to the land.
Until they die and return to the dust from which they came.
But God wants to restore humanity back to that 7th day rest. So he chooses to give the family of Israel that experience of ultimate rest so they can share it with others.
But how? They're in Egypt, slaves to an oppressive empire who's grinding them into the dust.
So God confronts Egypt and he liberates the Israelites, taking them through the darkness and chaos on the way to the promised land.
Now, while they're on their way, they find themselves in the wilderness. It's easy to get lost. Life is a struggle. They're not in the land of rest yet.
But while they're on the way, God invites them in the wilderness to start living as if they're in the promised land.
But how do you practice the future rest in the wilderness?
Well, God tells them that every 7th day, they are to stop their work, or in Hebrew, to Shabbat, so that they can rest and enjoy God's good world.
So take a whole day to live as if the ultimate rest has already come.
Yeah, this is the Sabbath, celebrated every week on the 7th day. But there's more. The Sabbath is just one of 7 festivals that Israel practiced every year, each one anticipating that 7th day rest.
That is a lot of 7s.
And there's even more. Every 7 years, the Israelites were to liberate slaves, forgive debts, and let the land rest for a whole year. And then every 7 times 7 years was the ultimate 7th day rest, called the year of Jubilee. If anyone had lost their land or gone into debt, all was forgiven, everything restored.
Wow, so the Sabbath, these feasts, the year of Jubilee, it's all pointing towards the hope of future rest.
Right. Now, when the Israelites went into the land, they forgot their God, and so they forfeited their chance for rest in the promised land.
They're exiled and enslaved again by an oppressive nation, led back into a world of chaos and disorder.
But Israel's prophets said that their exile would end one day, and that the ultimate jubilee of freedom and rest would come, but generations go by, and they're still waiting.
It's at this dark point in the story that Jesus appears, and he launches his public mission on a Sabbath day.
Yeah, he read aloud from the scroll of Isaiah, saying that it was time for all captives and slaves to be released because this was the year of the Lord's favor.
What did he mean? This is the year of the Lord's favor.
He was talking about the ultimate jubilee.
Also, Jesus is claiming that seventh day rest would come through him.
Right, he said that he was the Lord of the Sabbath, and he confronted disorder and darkness in all of its forms, liberating people from sickness, sin, even from death itself.
Yet, Jesus was killed, so even his work was undone.
Well, it seemed that way. But notice, Jesus timed his death to take place at the end of the week. His body rested in a tomb during the Sabbath, and on the 8th day, he rose from the dead.
Oh, wait, the eighth day? You mean the first day of a new week?
Exactly. Jesus' resurrection was like the first day of a new creation, where God's light and life broke into the darkness.
So because of the resurrection, we have hope in God's promise of future rest. But we're not there yet. It's like we're still in the wilderness, where we experience struggle and pain.
But as we journey towards that ultimate seventh day, Jesus invites us to experience a taste of real rest now by following him. Or in his words, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest.
Okay, so did that come through okay?
Yeah.
Amazing. So let me just boil that into a nutshell for you. God rests in creation. So notice it's not a lazy rest, but a rest that comes from knowing that the work has been completed. And he calls mankind, Adam and Eve, to rest in a similar way, but they in the garden rebel against God's plan. So God eventually gives Israel, the people of God, ways of finding rest through the law and through festivals, but they never fully entered into it until Jesus, who is the Lord of the Sabbath, came. Jesus provides true rest that Sabbath and the year of Jubilee pointed to through his death and resurrection. And so there is a rest in Jesus, a Sabbath that we can all enter into and enjoy and work from. And the writer to the book of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews 4 verse 1 that we should not try and ignore that invitation into Sabbath. It says this, therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. So in Christ, we are kings and queens of the seventh day rest, where we can be truly restored and recreated and rested until we experience that in its fullness in the new creation. So the question is, what should Sabbath look like for us? Well, in one sense, it's a rest that we can live in all the time. It's the seventh day rest that Jesus wins for us. That means that we're free from fear and striving and guilt and shame. The work has been done at the cross. But Sabbath means stopping. And so I understand Sabbath as a 24-hour period in our week where we consciously step into the rest that Jesus has won for us. So it's more than just lazing around or filling it with activity, but it's actively resting. So how do you do that? Well, let me give you 4 things. Number 1, you need to stop. So when we truly experience a good Sabbath, true rest, we stop. We stop from all our work. about thinking about work. We consciously put effort into stop worrying and wanting. And where possible, I would encourage you to turn your phone, but particularly your email, off. Personally, when I really want to rest, I turned all my WhatsApp notifications off. And I discipline my mind not to stress and worry about the things that are all going on in the background. And a lot of people that practice Sabbath often mark the start of it and the end of it by lighting a candle or having a meal or doing something which sort of closes the door to your often quite frantic activity and opens the door into this 24-hour period where you do actively rest. The Danish theologian and philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said, if I were allowed to prescribe just one remedy for all the ills of the modern world, I would prescribe silence. And so the idea is that we just quieten down the voices on our true Sabbaths. So I don't know if you have this in the States, but in the UK, some vans and lorries have speed limiters to stop vehicles going over a safe speed on the highways. And the Sabbath is like a speed limiter on the speed of life. So all week long, we work, we play, we cook, we clean, we shop, we exercise, we answer text messages, we inhabit the modern world, but we hit a limit. And so on the Sabbath, we slow down, and more than that, we just come to a full stop. So one of four things we do on Sabbath is we stop. And then secondly, we rest. So we rest our whole being. So physically, it might be that you try and sleep more than you normally do. Mentally and emotionally, you look to do things that calm you down, that relax you, that help you process the week. And that's a really key element of a Sabbath, because if you're wanting the rest of your week, which feels crazy, to be impacted by your true rest, then you need time in your Sabbath to actually process what's really going on. And spiritually speaking, in the Sabbath, you rest in God's love for us through abiding. So there's a real sense in which we actively pursue Jesus in those days off. You know, the most godly people I know, they can't wait to their Sabbath because they get more time with Jesus. And that more time with Jesus results in a rest that Jesus won for us at the cross, that has this spiritual dimension that you have to step into through relationship with Jesus. So you need to stop, you need to rest, you need to delight. So the idea of Sabbath is that you pamper your soul with activities that spark joy and wonder and gratitude and happiness. So for example, eating good food, or walking in nature, or spending time with family and friends, or serving others, using your gifts to bless others, listening to music, playing games, or just having fun before God. So for me, a perfect Sabbath would include chopping wood for my fire. So I've got a big collection of axes just to make me feel more manly, and I love to sort of get those axes out, the chainsaw out, and process lots of wood. I really like baking, so I like baking cakes, and I've got a really sweet tooth, so I love doing a bit of baking. I love reading. I've got a brilliant gas barbecue, so I love cooking food for friends on the barbecue. And always the best sort of Sabbaths includes a half an hour snooze in the afternoon. Like I'm getting to the age where that comes far too easily for me. And so I snooze during the day. So the idea is that we use our Sabbath to delight. And so you guys need to work out what activities bring about joy and wonder and gratitude in your life. Often we can feel bad for having those things, or we can feel too busy to truly enjoy them. And the point of the Sabbath is that it's this dedicated time for you to do those things with God. And then fourthly, I've talked about stopping, resting, delighting, and then fourthly, worshiping. So we encourage a heart that is full of grateful praise and adoration towards God. It's a chance for you to surrender your life afresh to God, 1 week at a time. And in those moments, we remember that Jesus himself is our truest Sabbath rest. So ultimately, my rest is not in a Sabbath, but in the one who promises the Sabbath rest, Jesus himself. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. So one of the activities that really practically speaking that I'd encourage you to do, that we do quite a bit, is an exercise. And do you all have either a phone or some paper with you that you can access? Have you all got something? Okay. If you've got a bit of paper, you could draw 4 circles. If you've just got something like a phone that you need to write it down, could you write 4 headings: physical, emotional, relational, and mental? And so I'll just keep that up. This is about as technological as I get, holding a bit of paper in front of a camera. But each circle represents a gauge. And so if you can't draw it, you just need to have a range beside physical, emotional, mental, and relational. You need to have a gauge between 1 and 10. For these where I'm drawing it, I've got empty and full. So think of this as like your fuel gauge in your car. But as I say, if you're just on your phone, you can write those 4 things down and have a range between 1 and 10. I just like drawing it out because I'm a visual learner. And the idea is that you note on this diagram how you're doing. So for example, on physical, are you doing really bad physically, or are you doing really well? And if I'm doing really well, I would draw my arrow like you would with a fuel tank towards fairly full. But if, for example, spiritually, I was feeling really low, I would draw it somewhat like that, near empty. So if you're writing it down, you would score, perhaps if spiritually you're not feeling like you're doing very well, you'd be a 2 or 3 out of 10. And if you're doing really well, you'd be an 8, 9, or 10. So it's a really, really simple way. Relational, that's often something people don't quite know what I mean. But it's like, how are you doing with your friendships? If you're doing less well relationally, you're probably isolating yourselves from others, or you're sort of somewhat not spending much quality time with people. And so why don't you just take a moment, why don't you just do that for yourselves? Why don't you just fill it out for yourselves? How are you doing spiritually, physically, relationally, and mentally right now? Give yourself a grade out of 10. I would encourage you, don't choose 5 for any of them, if you have already, because that doesn't really tell you much. So try and avoid 5. And so if you're someone who isn't very self-aware, or you're not too sure at times how you're doing, then this is a really good exercise to do at the start of your Sabbath, because you can plan a Sabbath that really feeds into the things that you feel most in need of, or that you feel weakest in, or you feel most empty in. And really encourage you to do that exercise. The mental one is the one that's probably most linked to how you're doing emotionally as well. And the emotional tank is the one that takes the longest always to fill up, and it's the quickest to empty. So most people's mental stroke emotional tank is the one that is hardest to fill up quickly. Okay, I've got a few more things that I want to say, but can we just pause there for a moment? And I'd love to know, like, any comments about what I've said, or any questions that you want to ask, because I've got a couple of more things I can say about this, but let's just pause for a minute. And yeah, anyone got any questions or anything they want to add to what I've shared?
I'll scoot over. Do you have any like recommendations for like things to do to fill each of those tanks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, it's probably you guys know yourselves the best. And so perhaps what would spiritually do me good might not do you much good. But spiritually, I would want to spend time with the Lord journaling, particularly. So most days I would get time reading my Bible, worshiping, praying about a number of things. But one thing that does me good is spending time working out what God's saying to me. How am I obeying? You know, just those two questions are great questions to ask yourself. What's God saying? And am I obeying what he said to me? Personally, I love reading Bible commentaries. I'm a bit of a nerd on that front. Most people find them boring, but I absolutely love reading Bible commentaries that tell me a lot of the background behind the text. But I'd also want to sort of say that one of my pathways to God is being outside. And so on a Sabbath, I nearly always go for a long walk, and it's being outside and just worshiping, maybe listening to something or praying really helps me. So that's a good question to ask yourself, is like, what pathway it works for you to be before God? For some, it's sung worship. For some, it's Bible study. For some, it's time alone. For some, it's time outside. For some, it's creative pursuits. So yeah, so there's some for spiritual. Physical, it's to do with, I guess, are you taking care of your body? So how are you doing with your eating? How are you doing with your exercising? How are you doing with perhaps even coping with injuries and long-term illness? Just like, how are you coping with those things? And so for me, I just know doing some exercise on my Sabbath really helps me just enjoy the rest of the day. It gives me energy, natural boost, and all of that. Relationally, it's quality time with friends. And so you can be around people constantly, but if there's no depth to those connections, then it's not quality time. You've just got quantity. And so if you're low relationally, I'd be trying to figure out how you get more quality time with people. And during COVID, I mean, in the UK, when we're only allowed out of our house once a day, I don't think you're in quite strict circumstances as that. But even in COVID, I imagine some of you have probably spent less time with others than normally, just because, you know, perhaps you've got underlying conditions that make it so you don't feel particularly safe. And then mentally and emotionally, I think that's all to do with probably having space to work out how you're feeling and how you're thinking. And are you an internal processor, or are you a sort of verbal processor? So are you someone that becomes clearer by spending time on your own, or are you someone who gets clearer by talking it through with others? And just knowing which of those two, or the combination of those two you are, will help you sort of just work out how you're doing emotionally. I hope that is somewhat what you were asking. I don't know if that was practical enough, but they were my first thoughts. Is that okay if I answered that question?
Yeah, thank you.
Anything else?
Yeah, I was wondering, how do you find the time to do a 24-hour period? I think that's what I struggle with, is that it feels really hard to like carve out time of my week to have a Sabbath.
Yeah. You just make sure it goes in first.
Yeah.
So it won't ever happen if you try and carve out time for it.
Yeah.
And so it's in my diary. That's for me, my Sabbath is usually between Friday and Saturday. And so normally if I wasn't doing this, Saturday would be free from any, so I work full time for the church, so free from church activity. I don't turn on my emails. I try and not look at my phone, try and be undisturbed, and I make it clear to as many people as possible without being rude that I'm not available. And so for you guys, the majority of your, it depends if you're working shifts and how your work works. But my guess is it will either be Saturday or Sunday, or from Friday, 7 p.m. when you finish work through to Saturday, 7 p.m. or, everyone will be different. But I think that would be the encouragement, is that you find your active rest and put it in first. And I'm selling this to you because I just think, you would easily fill up all your time with your work, friendship, and church commitments. And I don't think your Sabbath doesn't, I don't think you have to avoid all your church commitments on a Sabbath. But I think it's much more about us thinking about that Sabbath rest in a far more intentional way. I think most of us, just when we rest, we either just want to kick back and do nothing, or we perhaps choose things that don't engage us with Jesus, and we don't enter into that peace and rest and life that he has won for us. And so that it's almost like a repositioning of how you do your relaxation time, because there's true rest promised to you. That's why Jesus says, come to me, and I will give you rest. But at the same time, I do recognize that there's people have a lot going on, but it might be that you need to look at your diary from, a month from now and start ring fencing that time, because you might already have a load of commitments. But I'm not saying you can't see people. I'm not saying that you can't do stuff. I think it's just making sure you're not working. So whatever you do with your normal full-time job, or if you've got a couple of part-time jobs, and it's just making sure, I think we would all feel loads better if we just got off our screens for the majority of our Sabbath. I feel like we spend so much time in front of a screen. It's doesn't do us loads of good. But at the same time, my son, I've got 2 teenage sons, and the way they relax is in front of a screen. So, I'm happy to be told otherwise on that. Anything else you want to ask?
So for somebody whose life is really task oriented, like for those of us with jobs, and maybe we have a few part-time or really busy full-time, how do you stop yourself from mentally going to the place on a Sabbath of, okay, now I've got 4 tasks for today. I've got to take care of my emotional, my relational, my spiritual, and my mental. and that becomes your obsession for the whole day. And you get to the end of the day and you realize, if I haven't rested, I've just tried to complete 4 tasks.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that's where the self-awareness will really help you rest, because there might be something driving that restlessness, that task obsession that isn't healthy, that is somehow to do with achieving or completion or competition or whatever it is those internal motivations are. And I would encourage you to get familiar with what those things are. So you don't have to change your personality. Like, I love on my Sabbath having a list of things to do. Like, I love the clarity. I love ticking things off. I find that such a sweet element of bringing me peace. But I'm trying to make sure that the achievement in those things is not the thing that is feeding my soul. Ultimately, it's Jesus that's feeding me. And so I need to pick apart perhaps some of the wrong internal motivation behind the tasks, so that I'm truly going to Jesus and not whatever my normal motivation is in life. Does that help a little bit? So unpicking the internal motivations will help you. You don't have to stop becoming a task-focused person. It's that internal motivation behind completing the tasks and what the goal of the tasks is that I'm trying to teach you in. That it's about using those things to enter into the rest that God has for you.
Would you say a wiser, when we're talking about a Sabbath, I'm kind of getting the idea from you that we block out that 24-hour period to rest. Do you think it's better to say, I'm going to try to have a set 24 hours every week, like you said, Friday evening through Saturday? Or is it better to look at your weekly calendar and say, where do I have a 24-hour gap? And I'm going to then block that off now to make that my Sabbath, so that I don't let something else throughout the week just fill it, like house cleaning.
Yeah, I think it can work either way. So I do really well on rhythm. And so I like to know it's the same every week. But I know a lot of shift workers don't live with that ability. And so it will have to change. And I'm totally with you 100%. Get it in, like, try and plan. If you know what your schedule is going to be, even though it's continually shifting, to just include that within how you plan your time. Because you're right, it won't probably happen if you don't plan it.
Yeah.
Would you have any tips about getting motivated to actually be able to do this properly?
Yeah. So the 4 exercises that I talked to you about in terms of stopping and resting and delighting and worshiping, like, they're designed to build on each other. So I wouldn't be too worried about trying to do them all at once, especially if this is a new concept for you. But over the course of a month, try and ease your sort of your way in. And the thing is, you can't succeed or fail at this practice. The goal is to show up. So resist the urge to say, I'm bad at this, or this isn't for me, or I don't like this. You've got to be patient with the process and also yourself. So as with most things that are good for us, the payoff isn't immediate. Like, in the Bible, all the ways in which Jesus describes growth and fruitfulness and maturity is all organic. And it's all about fruit coming over time. So I just encourage you that that this is an investment that will do you good in months to come, rather than you will necessarily feel successful on your Sabbath. There's a lot of things that we do because we are sowing into a certain sort of life in order to reap a certain life in time. And what I would say to you is that I think it's very hard for the enemy, for Satan, to tempt well-rested, healthy, happy people. And as Christians, we've got every reason to be healthy and happy, spiritually healthy and happy people. But we often are the people that model that the least, because we're so busy, or we're so full on, or we've got so much going on. And so people will look at our lives and don't think, oh, they're living a life that I want, And so I think if Sabbath is good for your, to keep you from sin, is to keep you healthy, but I think it will make you more attractive as well. Lots more I could say. Some of you are, I'll be more attractive. You're looking at you, you don't need any help. So let me just talk about some of the lies that you might be believing about yourself. I think this ties into the last question. So there's a question of identity. So all of us are haunted by the work that's under the work. And so we either need to prove ourselves or save ourselves, or we need to gain a sense of worth or identity. And the world labels us according to what we can do, what we know, our past, our future potential to perform. And just as God calls us, or calls Israel to return to him, he calls us to say no to the roles and responsibilities others try and place on us, and say yes to who God has created us to be. So Brennan Manning says, define yourselves radically as one beloved by God. That's the true self. Every other identity is an illusion. And so what different choices would you make if you gave yourself permission to let go of the expectations other people push on you to be or do? So identity and any insecurity in your identity in Christ will create lies in you to behave and perform certain ways that will impact the way you rest. Secondly, worry. Are you able to give situations or people or things to God, like truly give them to him? Or do you hold them close to yourself? Because excessive worry will rob you of true Sabbath. God appointed the Sabbath to remind us that he's working and resting. To practice Sabbath is disciplined, and it's a faithful way to remember that you are not the one that keeps the world running. You're not the one that ultimately provides for your family. You're not the one who keeps your work projects moving forward. And so I'd want to say this to you. Sabbath is an act of trust. If you're a worrier, you have to put your trust in the sovereignty of God in a new way. So identity is an issue for us. I think that sense of worry is an issue. Fear, like if you fear others, you will always strive in life. Fear of failure means you'll overwork and not try at all. Fear of letting others down will mean you can't say no. So fear of being overwhelmed will mean that you say no when you can say yes. And so it's important you find a safe place to work out what your fears are. So some people are really bad at saying no, and it's because of fear. And some people are really bad at saying yes because of fear. And so again, my encouragement to you is to work out, what are you really scared of? It's important you have a safe place to work out what your fears are, where they're from, because if you can do that, you can work out how to fight. And then lastly, just on this note, I think materialism is a big deal in people truly resting. Because if you stop working, it will impact your finances or promotion prospects or your chance to pick up overtime, which impacts your ability to live at the standard of living you want to live at. So a question to ask yourself is, do you have unrealistic or culturally driven dreams and aspirations that are unbiblical or unhelpful? So if you're aspiring to a certain life, so you're a young church, so many of you will be thinking about buying houses or affording rent on a nicer place, A lot of you will be starting out in work and starting to ascend the sort of promotion and bigger salaries. And just the standard of living you choose will impact how hard you have to work. And some of you, that's the issue, is why you're not resting, is that you're wanting to earn too much money or more than what's appropriate right now for you. What's more important is that you find your rest in God. So there needs to be that sort of, review internally of those hidden agendas. It's the work behind the work. And if you can be more aware of your soul and what your weaknesses are or what your temptations are, then you can sort of go to war against those things, or you can feel better equipped to be able to truly rest. I hope that helps a bit. So personally, my temptation would be to work into my Sabbath, because I like control. I like that feeling that I'm on top of things. I can feel that projects are over-reliant on me and they won't happen, or they'll be delayed if I don't give the time to it. And so I have to consciously choose to lay those things down and trust that God is in charge and he's in control and is able to operate within my limits, rather than me almost just thinking I've got to work over and above my limits in order for God to be at work, which is just crazy thinking. But someone like me is naturally wired to sort of take it in that direction. Okay, we're running out of time. So what I'd like to do to finish is for you to, in pairs, just take a moment to share your numbers, if you're comfortable to do that, from your gauges. And why don't you say perhaps one thing that you found helpful from today, and then why don't you just take 5 minutes to pray for one another? Is that okay if we close out like that?
Yeah, I don't know if we'll quite have the time for 5 more minutes, but we can at least do a sharing and a prayer request, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's great.
All right, let's do it. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, man.
So nice to see you. Let me just quickly pray for you. Lord Jesus, Lord, please enable these dear brothers and sisters to enter into true rest. Lord, I pray they won't burn out. I pray for anyone whose shoulders just feel really heavy with work and responsibility. And I pray they would come to you afresh and find the true rest that you've promised for them. Amen.